Good afternoon, everybody from Dublin, on an unusually bright day for us this time of year. Um, really pleased to be here with this group today. I think as a group, we probably don't mix enough. It's fantastic to see that there's such activity across Europe, and I'm sure probably most of you have never heard of Learnovate. What I thought would be interesting to this group, or might be interesting to this group, is, we talked about the practical lessons learned in 2020, and I thought what I'd share with you is our approach toward innovation. I'm sure you all have your own processes, and they may be very similar to what we do at Learnovate, but I think even sharing uh, insights like that is very helpful for the group. So we take a very much problem first approach at Learnovate, and that's what I'd like to talk to you about today and how we had to adjust and deal with that in 2020. So first, as I say, because you may not have heard of us, we're a research centre based out of Trinity College, which is Ireland's leading university, around since 1592. And we're what's called a technology centre. So there are about 8 of these in Ireland. They're funded by 2 government agencies, Enterprise Ireland and IDA. Basically, those 2 institutions are responsible for generating foreign direct investment and the other for promoting exports. So we're a very applied research centre in that regard. We're looking to see if we can support that industry in Ireland, which is believed at a national level has a right to play in this global field. That's us. There's about 20 odd of us. Obviously, I think it always looks like a reasonable sized research center, but when you think about the idea of it having to be multidisciplinary and break it down into those disciplines, obviously you don't have so many in each discipline. Just a bit about myself. I spent a long time in the communications world. Probably what piqued my interest was the whole idea that communication and learning kind of were quite similar in that idea that what you're looking to do is bring about behavior change. And in communication terms, of course, the first thing you have to do is gain that person's attention, and then look to see what you can do through communication. And I think that idea of having to work hard and to motivate and engage and sort of make learners engaged and motivated to learn is the aspect of communication that I was interested in seeing if we could move across. So about sort of 7 years ago, I moved across to Learnovate. My original degree is in psychology. I have a master's in technology enhanced learning, and currently undertaking a PhD into my last year, looking at academic amotivation, the negative form of motivation in undergrad students, because it's a very serious issue for a lot of stakeholders. And I'm looking to see if we can address that through behavioral economics. If that's an area that interests you, I'll be talking an awful lot more about that on the 27th at one of these EETN sessions. When I'm not doing all that, I dabble about with paints. Okay, so in the center, we're kind of structured with 4 main focuses. Obviously, we need a technology focus. We very much see the UI UX aspect as playing a major role in terms of building that adoption and acceptance of any technologies. Learning, design, science, obviously, and that will be the space that I would come in. And then also innovation. And my role within the center is also to lead the innovation team. And I've developed our approach to innovation that I'll be talking to you about today. This is how we see the world, and I'd be interested to hear how you guys feel about this. But we see that there's an EdTech industry, and then there's what I'll broadly call learning organizations. And per se, those 2 get on fine day by day. Their services and products that they sell into the other to help the other achieve their objectives. Neither tend to have much time to focus on research and look at big problems. And invariably, as it's been described to me, what happens is a learning organization identifies a problem. EdTech industry kind of turns around to what it has to offer, and you end up with this kind of misty fit that doesn't tend to actually answer the question. But often what happens is neither party is really prepared to say that it's not working. That's where we see we can come in as Learnovate through innovation projects and try and crack those hard nuts and then get out of there. you know, so we try and help them solve these problems, but that's us done, and we move on to the next one. We work in two ways, through the funding we have through government and through the likes of Horizon 2020, or Horizon as it'll be in the upcoming call, to carry out research in areas we identify through industry and through collaborating with industry and involving industry in that. The second way we actually do operate is as a bespoke research center for individuals who may be looking to sort out a big problem. Usually when we're looking at that, we're working potentially with one or two organizations, but we find we can support those through those aforementioned government agencies to a certain extent. So they're the two main ways we identify and carry out the research and kick the can down the road and hopefully get it taken on, or as a bespoke research center. So to move on to what I wanted to look at today, the area of innovation for learning. So in terms of us getting our heads around this topic and how we might approach it, and you know, we can sort of argue the debate around sort of these terms and what they mean, but we needed to be very practical about it and deal with what comes in the door or what we're dealing with. So we tend to use these two phrases of innovation and transformation. And as you can see there on the left, we're saying that innovation is really when it's something new, something that hasn't kind of been there before. And then transformation is, of course, when we're looking to improve the scalability or the effectiveness of something that exists already. And we take a very different approach to how we start researching in those areas, depending on what way we identify it. And of course, as per the graduation there, you know, it is a spectrum. An awful lot of times it won't be pinned at one end or the other. If we move on through those initial stages, then we look through the innovation group to obviously go into that solution workshop phase, try and sort of get that ball rolling, get further validation, and then, you know, that build, measure, learn moving forward, looking for industry to take it up and run with it at some point, be that through a spin out or be that through IP licensing, etc. There are the three main areas that the innovation group will focus on in the early stages of a project. We won't have time to go through them. So I'm just going to focus in on that digital innovation. So when somebody's looking at something that's new or untested, you know, if we ask like, what is innovation? I think design thinking is more than likely a tool we're all incredibly familiar with and probably use in our day-to-day activities, and likewise ourselves. And again, Brendan Boyle there would kind of be one of the main players coming out of IDEO in this space. And we talk about desirable, feasible, viable. And again, it's this capacity to give non-traditional designers tools and methodologies to help them approach design thinking towards a human-centered solution. And to me, that sort of entire slide is all about that fun side of design thinking. But I think the other side of design thinking is really worth focusing on. You're looking to identify unmet needs, reducing risk, and looking for solutions that are going to be revolutionary and learn and iterate faster. And I would put that down very much as an entrepreneurial mindset. We're out of the kind of workshop side and saying, well, does somebody want or need, more importantly, what we're talking about? And that's the focus we take. We know there's an awful lot of different approaches that have emerged. Ash Mayura on Lean Startup will be this whole idea of build something, get out there, test it, iterate, pivot, come back and visit it again. And I think even the dress of the two guys gives us that sort of different approaches. You know, we have Ash in a kind of very business style approach to things, and then Brendan in that very sort of creative mode. We take this kind of toolkit approach. You know, there's a book, The Innovator's Method. I think it's Furr and Dyer, the guys, and they're very much in this space too, that don't become a design thinker or a lean startup. Look at the tools, adapt and use the individual tools as you see them appropriate. And that's what we've kind of done in Learnovate. But what we say is that there's two real essentials here. There's a problem and a solution. And we start, as I mentioned at the start of this, with the problem. Because solutions are seductive. We get into a workshop with all them little Post-its and the little furry things and Lego and all the rest of it. And everybody can have a really creative time looking at solutions. We just sort of say, well, let's start off with the problem. Excuse me, we look for painful problems worth solving. And even before we move on to there, we try and validate that it's a painful problem. And while it is an entire process, it's quite a short process. And what it's really there to do is, going back to that earlier slide, it's trying to stop us wasting time, or it's trying to inform the direction we might take. And if you actually look into lean startup and design thinking and an awful lot of the other models, underlying them all is jobs to be done. You may or you may not be familiar with jobs to be done, but we find it a really powerful tool. And I go back to that idea of a tool, and we leverage this quite a bit. So just looking at the whole jobs to be done aspect, it's this idea of jobs to be done, or another way of phrasing it is problems to be solved. And again, you guys are all in this space. I'm sure you're well familiar with Ted Levitt's quote there about people don't want 1/4-inch drill bits. They want 1/4-inch holes. You can't buy a 1/4-inch hole, so you have to buy the drill bit. And that in essence, it really is job to be done. You could extend that to say, maybe actually Ted wanted to hang a picture on a wall, not a 1/4-inch hole. But the more we understand what job we're trying to get done, the more creative we can be and the more insightful we can be about the solution that we're trying to bring to bear. And maybe just to bring that home a bit, that lovely yellow plastic handled roller on the left was mine. And I didn't buy it out of any love of cheap plastic paint rollers. It was that I had a job to be done, which was I needed to get paint on the wall. And even that little small step of understanding I wanted to get paint on a wall opens the solutions out to other options. I could think beyond paint and actually think of wallpaper, or I could think brushes, I could think of contractor. And there's so many different ways when I think beyond how do I make the best paint roller in the world. Yeah. And digging deeper into that, this was the aforementioned room. And we had some notion of painting it this color. I'm not sure what color. It's a bit like the blue gold dress. You could call it mauve or taupe or whatever. But it's a north facing room, and it made the room incredibly cold. And so we had an emotional job to be done to make that room cozy again. You know, so again, starting to get into the angles and facets of a job. And finally, my older daughter was having her graduation prom. I'm not sure what you call it in your particular countries. It's a Debs over here. And basically, you know, that brought a social job in. There was people going to come around to the house and wish her well and see her off. And funny enough, the social job became the trigger, you know, so that's what got the job done. So this idea of understanding jobs to be done and problems at a really deep level is how we kick off the process. There's a guy called Tony Ulwick. He would be one of the main proponents of, developers of the whole jobs to be done movement. And he says that when you do this, you end up with something that is stable over time and solution agnostic. Yeah. So that idea of not coming to somebody with a solution, about understanding the problem as deep as we can first. And if we go back to design thinking, this isn't, like I said, it's across the two of them. For those of you who'd be very familiar with design thinking, this is really just notching up the lens on those first two stages a lot more, on that empathize and define. Very often that might take place in the workshop, you know, but we treat it as a separate aspect to the process. And if is in purple and underlined there, because we say that to everybody coming in the door, if we validate the assumptions, we just might be able to create pull for that solution because we're answering some problem that we've identified. Startups give us a good idea around this whole area. And again, you know, I won't linger too much on this, but the whole idea that we see figures like 90% fail. Cambridge Associates talk about over 60%, but they're talking about companies that have achieved investment. So they're companies that have actually already convinced people that they have a good idea. And looking at why they fail, no market need above everything else is the big one. And it's either that nobody wants it or nobody's willing to pay for it, which is also important. So the problem might exist, but they may have a workaround, and that workaround is good enough. And irrespective of how altruistic we are, you know, we need somebody to pay for it to keep us in business. So we need to have these three aspects: a product that solves a problem for the customer, a business model to keep us in going and being able to deliver it, and then a team that can deliver it. Better again if we know what specific customer we're talking about and if it's a painful problem. Also, we'd need a sustainable business model. But once again, when we start in Learnovate, we don't worry about anything on the right. We focus just on two things. The customer, who are they? Who are they? Who are they? Who are they? Was that just me or did everybody else hear that?
I could hear that too. I think it was Abby's microphone.
It was just me making emphasis on who are. Okay, we look to ask the right questions. You know, we don't talk about guarantee of success or increased guarantee. We say, can we test this idea? Can we do it without a product and see if there's any demand? Ultimately, can we minimize the risk of wasting everybody's time and money? When we start off, we look at two things. We look to get our thinking really clear on these areas. And then we look to see, can we validate what we have come up with? We focus on the customer and the problem. So this all manifests as a workshop. We send out a diagnostic to attendees first, and we get them to fill that out, and that gives us some background for those areas I've just talked about. And then we start to focus in on that first area, customer. And we have two canvases that we use to work with them about the customer. And we say, who is your customer? And it's probably more than one. Is it going to be a B2B? Is it going to be a B2C? So we ask them to really focus in and get sharp on who that customer segment is. We avoid some of the areas like not segmenting, not being specific. Don't distinguish between the purchasing and user, because if there's a purchasing customer before the user, if the purchasing person doesn't recognize the problem, the user doesn't get to it. And not staying clear and consistent. So in the workshop, we would get them to work on this canvas first, identifying various segments. Then as a group, and again, all input is done individual and then come together collaboratively. And we get them to work this canvas through and identify out who's the low hanging fruit. Who's the one that if you had this idea developed in the morning and went out the door, who's the first person you would turn to and say, would you take this off me? We leave all the others there because they could be really important for us to come back at a later stage and review. And when we have our segment, we just try and put a bit of flesh on that and try and get some sort of proto-persona around who that individual is in the customer segment. And that's a great tool in terms of, we find in the workshop as we move on from here, if the name was Sharon, for instance, they will be talking about Sharon as we move through the workshop and as they get involved with it. So having got that profile through the two canvases of our customer, we move on and ask, what sort of jobs are they trying to get done? And we're trying to avoid the idea of not understanding the problem, as we've talked about, not putting the research into it, willing to accept there is no problem, not validating that with customers, and worse is poor validation, going out and basically wanting to hear what you're going to hear. And to do this, we take them through two canvases again. And the first one, we're going back to those functional, emotional, and social jobs. And at the top of this canvas, there would be a big blue piece here, which is the idea, because we're not trying to solve every problem. We're talking about what our idea might solve for this customer segment. And again, we work it through on Post-its. Further on, what benefits can they expect to accrue or outcomes if they are successful, and what barriers might they face on the way? Final is we ask them to strip down that last canvas and reposition them up here. And we get them to kind of rank out. And so what we're looking at are the top jobs to be done, what are the barriers, and what are the perceived outcomes. As a matter of interest, this is probably about a half day. We tend to find it's about a 3-hour workshop is probably what it works out at. And from there, we take that output away and develop out an interview script. And I talked about the toolbox earlier on. So when we're doing these interview scripts, we lean very heavily from Rob Fitzpatrick's The Mom Test. If you're not familiar with it, I suggest get it. It's a very small book, very short book, very easy read. But it's this whole idea about how to get to the truth when everyone's lying to you, you know? And it's about avoiding the opinions. It's about avoiding talking about your solution. And the way we do that is ask about situations in the past. And I'll just very briefly give you an example of what Rob would say here. So he says if he developed an app for Italian recipes and went to his mom and said, I've developed this app for Italian recipes, what do you think? Opinion, I love it. You know, would you buy it? Yes, I certainly would, son. Aren't you brilliant? Yeah. But if he was actually to go in there and ask her about situations in the past and say, where did you get your last Italian recipe from? She might say, well, they're all in my head. I've been making them for years. He goes, oh, okay, well, let's presume you wanted a new recipe. Where might you get it from? You say, well, there's only 3 Italian chefs in this world I'd actually trust to take a new recipe on board from. So suddenly, by avoiding opinions and solutions and asking about the past and never talking about the solution, we're finding out that maybe Rob's idea wasn't so good, at least not for his mom. And that's why he calls it the mom test. Yeah, if you can get the truth out of your mom, you're doing well. Okay. And this is just to give you a view. So we would take that output and we kind of get it into that general area that we're looking at, you know. So we're saying Sharon here needs to minimize the impact of driver ill health to her organization. We kind of put some flesh on it there. And then we develop it into those questions. You know, in terms of illness, what aspects do you find occur most frequently? Now, our solution here, as it happens, was in the area of diabetes. We don't mention diabetes here at all. We're just actually waiting to see, is diabetes a raising issue for her and the solution that might be proposed. And from there, we go and talk to as many Sharons as we have the ability to within the scope of the project. And we synthesize that and we report back. We find 3 things when we go on that journey. We find that our assumptions are validated. We find they're not validated. But also we find insights. We find things that we haven't thought of in that workshop. And it's coming directly from Sharon, who we think has the problem. So they're really valuable. And that helps us move forward. So just in terms of how that works, there's us earlier this year. We ran a Horizon 2020 project called Develop, and that's some of the team in Learnovate. We have that fantastic room. It's really quite a large room for workshops. And we would work through with that team, and there you go. There's the canvases, the 4 canvases, and this is what they'll end up like. And you can see on this one, the guys actually needed more space and we're out to the right of it. And of course, being a social event, you know, the sandwiches are always really important for the workshops. So that's the way we work them. Very social, very interactive sessions. And then that happened. Yeah. So 12th of March was our date. We were all sent home and we were all told, see you sometime. And we would have had maybe 4 or 5 workshops again, just in terms of giving you some sort of idea, I suppose. I mentioned at the start, we would have the exact same processes developed for that idea of digital transformation and for the solutions workshop. So we have different but the same, if it makes sense, canvases and processes and workshops developed for each of those areas. And we had all of those coming up. So again, I'm sure you've all had need or want or have been in touch with these 2 products or services, Mural and Miro. They're online whiteboards. And what I think is really fantastic about them is that actually they do exactly what they say on the tin. They are functional whiteboards to collaborate online. And we had to really quickly think about what we could do. So we ran a pilot phase. And after that pilot phase, we decided Miro by an absolute nats was a little bit better than Mural. It's very hard to decide between those 2, but we had to make a decision. We went with Miro. And we ran a few clunky workshops, real live ones, and we muddled our way through them, but we got there. So what we did is we built some supports for the rest of the team. We developed out sort of 8 online quick videos, only designed to get the guys running and been able to use it. We set up a Slack channel for ourselves because we were all coming across these little bits and pieces that could help. And as you can see there, if you have an Excel sheet of data, you can just pop it into Miro and it comes in as individual post-its. So we started to get familiar with it. And then what we did was we moved all our canvases to Miro. And you can see for the individual input, we left a space down the middle for individual sketch pads. And again, if you're familiar with these tools, you'll know that they're vector based. So I can zoom all the way in just to that space there, and it's as sharp as anything. So they're really good for that individual space. You just get people to zoom into their own sketch areas, work on their own, and then collaborate on each of the canvases. And as we got more and more familiar with it, it really started to work really well for us. And we were able to run all our live workshops through Miro really without missing a heartbeat, and the subsequent follow-up interviews, you know, so we were able to do all our interviews. We do use Zoom with it. So 2 screens tends to be handy because we use Zoom for when we want to use breakout rooms and all that. So we found we could get up and running and run our innovation services using these digital tools remotely pretty well. And then we found we could do some things that we couldn't do back in Learnovate. So the one on the right there is a workshop that I ran because I also lecture in innovation, and that's basically an entire solution process run with 15 students using breakout rooms. And for scale, that's pretty much what the size of a manual or a physical board would have looked like. So I would have struggled to find that amount of space in Trinity with free wall space to be able to do that. And then moving on, it's now just how we work. So this is a live project we're working on at the moment around extracting the business value of learning and development and how to show that on up to the C-suite. And we're doing an awful lot of our thinking in Miro. So this isn't for external, this is us, and this is no formal per se workshop. This is just us putting our stuff together in there. So we're finding it to be a fantastic tool, and it's really helped us keep our innovation moving and keeping it online. As Ted Levitt said, it's getting the job done for us. So we had a painful problem, and it's solving our problem. The only one thing I'd say is we haven't worked out about the sandwiches yet. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Peter. It was really interesting. I must say, I came across this methodology some time ago, and one of the things that really seemed interesting to me was the design of the interviews that you mentioned. So after going through the analysis of the painful problems, and first of all, identifying how painful the problem is and if it's painful enough to take care of it. Yeah. Later, designing this interview seemed to be another big job to be done, because as you said, you are not asking questions of, okay, what problem do you have? You would rather ask the question about their life, their needs, their dreams. So you go to a completely new area that you haven't thought about before, and that well, in theory, doesn't have anything to do with the problem that you are trying to solve. And at the same time, you're discovering so many new things from that conversation, right?
Yeah, I agree. So, I mean, again, if we went back to the top ranked jobs, problems and barriers, it's based on those, and we're honing in, but we're reverse engineering. And I would suggest, yes, it can be more akin to an art than a science, because it is sharp. You're looking to basically, you want to be able to stitch it back up the line and say, no, that doesn't exist, or yes, that does exist. But by the same token, and we don't do a cloak and dagger on it, by the way. We do say we're working in the area of diabetes and solutions that may be able to help, but I'd much prefer to talk to you today about your life and the issues you face, you know? So that's kind of the way we set it. So because again, they're sort of going, why am I talking to you in this way? When basically, you know, they're not talking about anything. And as I say, and we would tend to do between 5 and 10 of those interviews, and that's enough. When you're doing that sort of qualitative, they tend to be about 40 minutes long, but it's enough to start. And we may well go back and verify after that. So start to look, can we develop those thoughts on out into surveys and survey on out? And like I say, I mean, it sounds like time that could be spent developing a solution or research. We would like to think we can get that process done in a month. And we have such an incredibly sharper way to move forward into a solution from there. You know, so we feel it's time well spent. Yeah.
Great. We have one question here from Italo. Peter, have you used design thinking in the classroom? So talking about these two approaches, and you finding the third way, really, have you really used design thinking?
Yes, absolutely. So if I had a graphic of, and Italo, first, Thank you so much for swapping with me today. I so appreciate that. Yeah. Yeah, so I mean, our solution process would be very aligned to design thinking. Yeah. So that's really what I was saying, that we see it as that toolkit. So we go forward with that problem into our solution workshop, which would be very much around that idea of applying design thinking from there. And we would use certain tools. We would use Board of Innovation have some great tools that they make freely available, like the alphabet approach and the 52 cards. These are great little tools to get people. What we say about the solution workshop is you're trying to get people to expand their thinking. And what you need to do to get them to do that is provide them with tools. You know, if you just give them Post-its and stickies and say, go at it. So I do find the likes of, as I said, the alphabet and the 52 cards and the opposite thinking as well, which is another one around the, you know, if you think a chair should normally have 4 legs, what about a chair that had no legs? Or what about a chair that had 1,000 legs? Then how could I take that concept and move it on into what I'm thinking about? Could I apply that opposite thinking to the solution? So very much, Italo, very much wed to design thinking. You know, it's just we try and tee it up by getting the problem straight first.